of further integration of the single market. At the same time, I think somewhat paradoxically, it gave quite strong impetus for the EU to more actively negotiate free trade agreements with third countries. Most of those examples that were just mentioned, for example, FTA with Japan, I think the dynamics to try to conclude as soon as possible negotiations with Japan by the EU was to a large extent driven by desire to show those Brits that, well, we are also global trading power and we can do much more together than you will be able to do after you leave us. I think there is this kind of political competition now, which is also visible with the British Prime Minister and ministers actively visiting China, India, Australia, talking to them about possible trade agreements after the UK leaves EU. So there is this side effect, which I think is quite good. It's good that EU has been energized a little bit by this. Of course, also uncertainty about US foreign trade policies contributes to such an EU activeness. And another effect, of course, is Brexit effect on multi-annual budget, MFF. It will go down as a result of this. It's clear. We know the proposals of the European Commission that have been publicized in May. There are some suggestions to increase funding by some member states, but I think it will make negotiations on new financial perspective much more difficult. I hope this might push to reform the EU budget, but history tells us it doesn't happen. I mean, the whole history of EU budget, I think, is the history of incrementalism and muddling through with farmers, especially watching very closely to make sure they are not losing their subsidies and other forms of financial support, although economists have been saying for many years that agriculture and some other areas are not those areas where such budget as the EU budget should focus on. If we talk about European value added, it's infrastructure projects like transport, energy links, border protection, things like that, scientific research. These are the areas where European value added would be highest by using EU budget. It's not agriculture, it's not social support, partly because of the differences in the level of income in different EU member states. So I hope maybe this Brexit fiscal shock for the EU budget might at least a little bit push this debate about the next MFF towards more rational structure. And of course there are security issues, but I guess they will be discussed in the next panel, yes. Because Baltic states, I think, are specific among all EU member states in their treatment of Brexit, because they attach very strong importance to security effects of Brexit, notwithstanding that UK will remain NATO member, but still, I think if we look into the priority list of what Baltic states emphasize when they participate in Brexit negotiations, or well, when they mandated Mr. Barnier to negotiate, it's citizens' rights, its effects on trade, effects on EU budget, and security. I would say these are the most important issues. Sometimes security comes first.
No, with agreeing with most what Ramonas was just saying, a couple of remarks which I was thinking about. I'm just reforming the EU budget because of the Brexit. The question is, in advantage of who? who's going to be gaining the most
all Europeans.
All Europeans, yes. Now, well, when we talk about all Europeans and reforming the budget and how would it be shaped like, then of course the question is about the common agricultural policy, as you mentioned. But I don't see that going away, because that is an essential part of the whole structure of the European Union budget and European Union economy, in spite of the fact that maybe it's not necessarily always the most lucrative. At the same time, I think the Brits leaving is actually going to be causing the problems with the cohesion, because they have always been pushing more for the cohesion policies to be developed more into the cohesion budget. And actually, at this moment, loss of the British voice is part of the process that it can be just simply weakened. As regards the social funding, then that's literally the thing which puts the European Union closer to its population. So in this case, out of just simply political reasons, having the social funds available to the general population is the way forward. The last remark, I think, and Ambassador Russo was actually mentioning this during the first panel, is that to a large extent, what's going to happen with the Brexit is and how it will affect the Nordic-Baltic cooperation to a large extent. It's the very fact that we have always been somewhat in the same mindset about how the economy should be functioning. Well, we have been the fiscally prudent or the fans of austerity or whatever else many of our countries have been called, and market liberals in the traditional sense. So in this case, apparently the voice will have to, this voice of, if I may say so, reason, or voice of alternative, will have to be coming from the Nordic-Baltic region, apparently more stronger than it was before.
Nele, Anders.
Yeah, just a short remark on the Brexit effect on EU budget. And I mean, there is potential to create some divisions between the Nordics and Baltics, at least maybe some of the aspects of the budget size, particularly as UK is not there anymore for loudly speak against any increases, then I guess that the current net contributors have to raise their voice against bigger budgets, and as the Nordics are net contributors, then this might be a potential kind of division line with Nordics and Baltics. But you could say that the rest of the economic files, I guess that there is more argument for a kind of a joint approach for this liberal, no nonsense regulation. So I think this is kind of again uniting us, but there would be issues where we will be more divided maybe.
Is there something happening in practical terms also, I mean, on the coordinating better the positions? I'm asking because I have also the background from the Minister of Economy, and then I was there when the Brexit vote happened, and then already the discussion started that we should coordinate more and we should have a joint strategy and we should do that and that. But in practical terms, of course, more or less everything continued as before. So I'm just wondering on what situation today.
Yeah, I would say it is still case by case basis that you do when it's needed.
Nele.
Well, I would say the day Brexit happens, I think there are three layers of impact to look at. One is indeed, as was mentioned, is the impact on the actual decision making in the EU on trade policy. And it will recalibrate, if you wish, probably the alliances that are long ingrained and long held for some parts. The second aspect, obviously, is, and this is entirely up to the leaders of the 27 member states to define, is what sort of a trading relationship, what sort of a free trade agreement the EU would then negotiate with the UK. And I think the third one, from trade policy perspective, which is also a relevant question, is how will the EU's and the UK's relationship to the other trading partners in the third countries be? So because if you wish, the divorce will also happen with the rest of the world, so to say. So there is plenty of impacts to come, I would say.
I'm sure there are many questions from the audience. Please, go ahead. Kristi is the first one. Let's take 2 or 3 and then try to answer.
Thank you. I would like to come back to this issue of the so-called Hanseatic League or the Group of 8, which has been discussed already. My impression, based on my discussions with, or in the representations of the Nordic and Baltic member states in Brussels, is that when you talk to people working on finance, they are much more forthcoming and keen on this label of the Hanseatic League and this grouping. And when you talk to diplomats, people from the foreign ministries, they are much more cautious. So maybe you could reflect on why this is so, and also address the related question of how much in the end does this division to Eurozone members and non-Eurozone members matter, or where does it matter and where does it not matter? And do you think it will become more important as a dividing line, also a dividing line that runs within the Nordic-Baltic group? Or maybe this is something where actually the Nordic-Baltic countries share an interest and want to avoid becoming this dividing line more important. Thanks.
Thanks. Any other? Yes, please.
Well, thank you, Eurozone Foreign Ministry. Well, European vision of trade agreements has been that we think what we are putting forward is somehow more progressive. It includes things like, for example, environment or labor standards. And then at the same time, we see Americans in action doing a deal with the Mexicans. I don't think there's anything on environment there. There certainly is nothing on labor standards, because the regulation which basically prices out Mexican auto workers is not a labor standard, but it's just taking a market advantage. And if Americans will be able to include or suck in the Canadians into that agreement, at the same time we have our own agreement with the Canadians. So my question is how long this progressive thought will actually stand, or we will notice that there actually will be 2 kinds of world trade. One dominated maybe by countries like China and US, if they manage to do something between themselves, which seems to be a distant possibility, but on the last 2 years' experience can't be ruled out. And then the other vision, which is more the European one, which says it's actually so many more things, and actually where Europe has been advancing European agenda by trying to co-opt and integrate countries who are maybe not totally ready, but somehow convinced to try and join and come on board. And from the other side, basically Americans, like we hear Trump saying to Canadians, making it, I think, politically impossible for Canadians to join by telling them that they are the only ones who will lose if they will not join. Americans will win anyway, and putting pressure on Canadians to basically backtrack on their own principles. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Any other questions? Well, we have actually 3 very big topics now to cover. On the last one, I would say the future of trade. In a way, you could call it like not political aspects of trade, but these additional aspects which always have been very relevant to Europeans, and in particular, I would say, in our region, also to the Nordic countries, to have the labor standards, to have the environment standards, all in the trade agreements. Can we continue with that? Secondly, still the Eurozone, how divisive this Eurozone membership is. And thirdly, then the Hanseatic League. And here I would maybe add already from my side also that the EU, it's my personal perspective, that EU has created already quite a lot of regulatory environment for countries to cooperate compared with what was there before. That now, when we have an Hanseatic League, then it can be only by name, or there should be some substance. If there is some substance, then there should be something more than the EU regulations today. And so, what is this more than what should be there in order to really have it as a special initiative? Who wants to start? Please.
Sure. If I may start from the last question, I agree that there might be such a scenario, as you said, some sort of two-track trade negotiation process, but I think it is still too early to say. And one factor that might be important in how US trade policies and EU trade policies develop is the fate of TTIP, Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. It has been put on hold when Donald Trump was elected, I think since March or April 2017, there were, as far as I know, no practical further talks in negotiations. But after this interesting, to put it mildly, meeting of Donald Trump and Jean-Claude Juncker in Washington, where they declared, well, to quote it, that they will, as Donald Trump said, they agreed to work together towards zero tariffs, zero non-tariff barriers, and zero subsidies on non-auto industrial goods. The end of quote. Nobody knows what's going to happen. My guess
Nele
is...
knows maybe. Nele can comment.
Well, yeah, maybe. My guess is nothing will happen out of this. I wish it meant a revival of TTIP. I think Baltic Nordic countries would benefit a lot, not only economically from transatlantic trade and investment partnership being concluded between US and EU. This would also provide a different scenario to the one that you described. But unfortunately, I don't think that something this executive working group of very intelligent people, as Trump called it, probably will not come up with anything that could be later practically implemented by the US in particular, I think. So that would be my short comment on this question. What concerns Hanseatic League, yes, I agree with you that there seems to be a difference. In Lithuania, for example, I also see differences of position between our Ministry of Finance and, for example, our central bank. Central bank being much more enthusiastic and talking much more about further completion of the EMU, banking union, things like that. Ministry of Finance more about that current already agreed rules should be properly implemented, like fiscal compact, prudent budgetary rules. It's cautious about tax harmonization, which is now again revived by German-French declaration a couple of months ago. So I see these institutional differences, and I think ministers of finance are they think very similarly in all those countries. They are in charge of balanced budgets, I think, so they have very similar policy approach, which makes it easy for them to declare common positions. Central bankers, they are personally independent. They act as independent actors in the ECB board, and my impression is it very much depends on concrete person. Diplomats, and let's say our president, her position is talking as little as possible about further steps of integration on EU reform, because if you say too much, and later there is an agreement which is not in line with what you said, you are perceived publicly as a loser. So she is very careful not to draw any red lines on EMU reform, on further banking union steps and things like that. So I think this flexibility is very popular among diplomats. Let's be flexible, which means let's not say too much in detail about what our national preferences are. Thank you.
Yeah, just a couple of remarks. Kristi, your question on whether the Eurozone can actually becoming a new dividing line in between the Nordic-Baltic countries. I would say as long as we don't have any asymmetric shocks, then no. At the moment when there's going to be a question in this environment of interdependence, who saves whom and on what and why is being that done and who pays for what, at that moment we could actually have the situation. Because the Eurozone integration, the further Eurozone integration is aimed at basically addressing both the symmetrical shocks, that would be the easiest version, relatively easiest. The other thing is how to address also the asymmetric shocks within the Eurozone, but the very fact again being the interrelation, interdependence of the financial sectors, interdependence of many of the industries between the Baltic Nordic countries, and in that case, there's always going to be the question how and what who is responsible for whom, and at that moment, there are going to be political players who could, of course, use and abuse the situation in their advantage. The other thing, the question, a little remark on the standardization, and I think to a large extent this international trade, what already had been started, and what Nell was already saying, is that the question is about the production and selling of the products based on which standards. This is basically what the European Union has been doing already for several years, is trying to sell the standards, try to convince the partners that if you are producing that type of product, then it should be this, and this. And it's only then it can be called, well, product A, and it cannot be called another way. And so in this case, even if we're looking at the restructuring of the world trade, this aspect of what is called what and how it can be sold, and only this product can be sold, that issue will still remain there, and in my mind that's one of the trump cards. Sorry, lack of one of the main advantages or one of the main cards that the European Union still is going to hold in international trade. Trump card.
So let me then give a quick comment on what Karlis was elaborating on, prompted by Juhani's question. I think we should put in context the meeting of President Trump and President Juncker, end of July, which was against the background of Section 232. So basically, Americans initiated a national security investigations into steel and aluminium, and these talks in Washington happened against the tariffs that were put upon European products of steel, 25%, and aluminium, 10% going to the States. And most importantly, the investigation into car sectors that had been launched by the US. Now, the statement that was issued cannot be read as to lead to TTIP 2. So therefore, I mean, it outlines the scope of the further work, which is short-term measures that the EU would buy more soybeans from the US. Indeed, the sales have come up in 1 year to 180% already, and more LNG energy. And then there is also now a strive towards eliminating industrial tariffs and enhancing, in a voluntary basis, regulatory cooperation. And finally, as I was saying earlier, to promote the level playing field through reforming WTO. And the talks, you were talking about executive working group. Well, I'm happy to say it meets now on Monday for the first time. And this will then launch the talks about talks, if you see what I mean. So it will be early stages of trying to scope the relationship. So I think again, I mean, in the current multilateral trading system context and the challenges there too, it's difficult to imagine a TTIP 2.
Would you like to say something about Transatlantic League also, or no? Because it's also about trade. I would say what we see here, like in the old city, etc. It's very much because of the Hanseatic League what we had days ago, and now the trade is a common competence of the Commission.
Well, I think we have discussed today a lot of the openness of that these nations around the Baltic Sea have to trade, and I suppose that Hanseatic League is obviously at the origin of this willingness to be open, but also the need to be open and trade. So, I mean, I think it is entirely up to the countries involved to form their alliances, but I'm sure it can be supportive of open and value-based EU trade policy.
Anders,
Yes.
Eurozone.
Yeah, maybe just on Hanseatic League as well, that I guess for the finance ministers it was easier to be more forthcoming because it was their positions and what they supported. They probably did not think too much what would be the kind of ramifications for other areas, that if you will kind of multiply this to I don't know, trade or defense or others, the same grouping. So that's I think the reason that the finance ministers have been more forthcoming on this issue. But on the division lines and the Eurozone, I think if I mean, really those discussions now, that if you manage to have them really in inclusive format, and that the end result, whatever it will be, that it will not raise the barriers to get into the Eurozone, and at the same time will not kind of increase the kind of or also increase the level where the acceptance of the public for this Euro project would be very difficult to achieve. That is, I think, would be a problem. But if we manage to have it kind of also public acceptance to this result, then I think after a couple of years, maybe also the ones who are out, they are ready to reconsider. So.
Thanks a lot for all your thoughts. Very many interesting ideas. I think the very general conclusion is indeed, it's what I also started, that there is a high dependency, a lot of conversion, very high integration what concerns economy of the Nordic-Baltic countries, and in broad terms it's all very positive and very beneficial to our region. But there are issues which needs to be at least discussed, if not tackled in the future, what concerns the policy towards the Eurozone, the overall policy in the EU after Brexit, the future of trade negotiations, future of international trade, and how the details and maybe some shifts in the focuses will influence the trade of the Nordic-Baltic countries. And then, of course, the question, but I would put the Hanseatic League question still into the framework, that what then we could do in addition to belonging together in the EU, and maybe involving also other countries who are not Nordic-Baltic, other countries who are not in the EU. And there are still, I think, more room what we managed to discuss here on the future cooperation. Here, I think we can conclude our panel. I think our panelists have deserved this applause. And now we have lunchtime, and I was asked to say that after the lunch, please don't come back here directly, but firstly go to where there is this exhibition room in the balcony, and there will be an illustration of the experiment, which should be very fancy, very nice, very interesting. The people who don't like loud noise, then it's not so much for them, as I understand. But it will be exciting, and it will happen around 2 o'clock. So please go there first, and then we can continue with our discussions afterwards. Thanks, and bon appétit.